Nietzsche in particular predicted what was going to happen in the 20th century. I'm going to read you something that he wrote. I'm going to try to tell you today why the events in the 20th century happened, so the mass genocidal movements in particular, which were probably the defining characteristic of the 20th century, and then also what that has to do with individual psychology. I mean, my first degree was in political science, and I was interested in political science because I was interested fundamentally in the reason that human societies went to war. And when I was studying political science, which is quite a long time ago, the fundamental theory that underlie political scientists' explanations for conflict were economic. People fight over resources. And that never seemed reasonable to me because, first of all, obviously many wars are fought for other reasons than resources. Two Central American countries, I think it was Guatemala and Honduras, if I remember correctly, went to war over a soccer game. So the outcome of the disputed outcome of a soccer game. And even if you do think that the reason that groups of people engage in conflict are for economic reasons, that doesn't exactly explain much, because that doesn't explain whether they're fighting because of absolute differences in wealth, or because of relative discrepancies in wealth, and those are very, very different causal elements. And then even if people do fight for economic reasons, which means they're fighting for things that they value, it isn't exactly clear why people value what they value, because different societies value different things. So economics, in the final analysis, ends up being a shallow explanation. And I pursued economic and political and sociological explanations for social conflict for a long time, but eventually they became untenable to me, and that's partly why I went and studied clinical psychology, because it struck me that the right level of analysis for understanding mass movements like the Nazi movement or the ideological possession that characterized the Stalinist Soviets or Mao's communists or Pol Pot's Cambodian communists, or any of the dictators that you can talk about who were on the far left or the far right during the 20th century. To me, those were failings of individual personality. And the most astute writers that I've ever read who described what they assumed to be the causes of these terrible conflicts made the same point, which is why I'm having you read Viktor Frankl and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, because Solzhenitsyn is not generally regarded as a personality psychologist, but he, of all the people I've ever read, he's the one who lays out the connection between the existential failure of the individual and the mass catastrophes of society. And to me, that's too important a link to overlook. And it also strikes me that it's the primary lesson of the 20th century. I mean, one lesson, for example, is beware of ideologies. And the reason I'm going to walk you through Nietzsche and a bit of Kierkegaard today is because these people in the late 19th century, with their antennas up, knew that the collapse, one way of looking at it is the collapse of traditional Western values. That's one way of looking at what set up the preconditions for humanity's susceptibility to ideologies in the 20th century. The other way of looking at it, in some sense, is that as the world came together in the 19th century and ideas were passed around from culture to culture more rapidly than they had ever been passed around, every culture suffered deculturation in some sense, because if I believe something and you believe something, and there's a long history behind both of our beliefs, when we come into contact, we'll either fight and I'll try to destroy you, or if I don't, if I take you seriously and you take me seriously, then that's going to leave us both wondering exactly what's rock solid underneath us.